ia o te wa I whaatilo atu le paia mal mamalu wa fia. Ma lo so I fua malangi mama, e whaftaile alofa o le atua wa taitai mailo to so I fua, ia masomato wola ili ne yaso na ato faina. Yeah, good afternoon, Nisam Bulavinaka. We extend to you warm Pacific greetings. My name, as the technical facilitator has said, is Leituala, Kuiniselani, Toelupe, Tago, Elisara. I will be your moderator for this session. We wanted to begin by acknowledging the organizers for the conference, the distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Our panel, as you can see, are all wearing black, because today is Thursdays in Black, where our organization, as the lead Pacific Technical Agency for Gender Equality, continues to support our cause to eliminate all forms of violence against women. And today, like we do every Thursday, we stand together in solidarity with our members, with our colleagues, with our partners, and with all of our Pacific sisters in our fights for the elimination of all forms of violence against women. Now, as the world wrestles with the changing landscape and environment brought about by COVID-19, organizations and institutions engage in developing different recipes for change, innovating around our knowledge and innovating around what we know to make sense of our rapidly changing world. For the Pacific region, the ongoing search for and development of different recipes reflects the need to be adaptive in a changing environment towards co-creating post-pandemic futures that are responsive and relevant for our people. The Pacific region acknowledges that our future is in our past, and futures thinking is not new to our region. As the Pacific community, our existence as an intergovernmental, scientific and technical organization owned by Pacific countries and territories brings a multi-sectoral and multidisciplinary perspective on futures that bridges modern science, indigenous knowledge, and people-centered approaches grounded in our context and values as Pacific people. And this is what we bring to the table for the Asia-Pacific Futures Network Dialogue. Our session today utilizes the art of weaving in the Pacific, passed on and carried through by our master weavers as a symbol to demonstrate how we fuse the different ingredients and flavors in terms of our science, our knowledge, our cultural context, and our values across our Foresight work. But more importantly, how we continue to reciprocate the sharing of that knowledge and learning across our Blue Pacific continent. The application of Foresight and futures thinking, therefore, reminds us of a Samoan concept, namely si'i le matala langa. It's a concept, excuse me, sorry. It's a concept that derives from the art of weaving, and it refers to the act of making a closer plait in the event that the quality of the weaving becomes inconsistent with the standard that was set from the beginning. And the act of si'i le matala langa refers to a change of behavior or change of action for the better. In this instance, it's applied to refer to our adaptability to the changing context and landscape that COVID has created. And it describes our collective efforts to make those adaptations a reality, to weave a Pacific map that withstands the changing currents of the ocean, and to enable us to chart our canoe in a different and new environment. Joining us today are some of our own Pacific Futures champions across sectors who will share with us some of their own learning and applications as part of this dialogue. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panel in the following order. Our first panelist is Ms. Sarah Mecartney, our Principal Strategy Advisor from our Strategy, Performance and Learning team. Our second panelist is Dr. Amerita Ravuvu, who is our Non-Communicable Diseases Advisor from our Public Health Division. Our third panelist is Ms. Kristel Griffiths, our strategy and foresight advisor, also from our strategy, performance and learning team. And our final panelist is Dr. Mema Motusaga, our youth and social inclusion advisor from our human rights and social development division. The way we will do this is we will adopt a Talanoa setting where I will invite our panelists to answer some questions to inform our dialogue. And without further ado, I would like to begin with our colleague in Nomea, Ms. Sarah Mecartney. Sarah, you've been charged with delivering a strategy for the organization during the COVID disruptions. What impact has this had on delivering on the strategy?
So it seems we had the same problem we had before.
With Emily, yes.
I think the only way of
Sarah,
doing
we can't.
is of
Sarah,
going in and
we
out.
can't hear
maybe.
you.
Let me see. Can we do a test in the moment with Amerita, Kristel, and Mema? Can you check if your sound works? Mema?
Hello, hello.
Hello, can
yes,
you hear
yes.
me? Yeah,
And
we can hear you,
Kristel?
Mema.
Hello.
Yes, and Sarah again. Can you log in and out one more time? And maybe Leituala, is it possible to start with another person first in the meantime? Or will we wait for 30 seconds?
I'd like to wait for Sarah, please, if that's okay.
Okay, absolutely. So in the meantime, everybody who joins here, maybe you want to share who you are in the chat and make use of the chat, please, so that we hear your thoughts and insights. Okay, so I will just, Sarah will be co-host in a second. Okay, can we have someone find her? Ah, here it is. And so
Can
Sarah,
you hear me?
excellent.
Yes.
Over.
I had that predicted in my future. Always a great way to start. Apologies for that. And pick up, if I may, with Leituala's question on what the COVID disruption, what impact that had on SPC's efforts to co-developing our next strategy. Thank you all for your patience, and thank you for many of you in the audience who are actually very much a core part of this story. We wouldn't be here without you. We start at the beginning, always a useful place to start. SPC has been brought into the futures world, or the strategic foresight world because of our members' thought leadership. In 2019, they tasked us to explore futures to prepare for a changing world. And this has really been the platform for being able to tell our Pacific story, drawing on our agency, our culture, and our insights to co-develop our next strategic plan. Our leaders have really highlighted how sense-making of all the interconnected forces that influence and shape our world can inform more robust decision-making, but with the use of strategic foresight. For me personally, my work has focused on facilitating a forward-thinking organizational strategy for the Pacific community that not only maintains our relevance and service to our region, but also better prepares and position us and our communities to adapt to a rapidly changing world. Our approach has really focused on blending Pacific ways of knowing and learning, and using strategic foresight tools and approaches to co-develop with our members, across our staff, and with our partners. This has really been an opportunity to shape and strengthen our resilience by design and not by default. In 2020, COVID-19 actually helped us to further realize the utility of futures thinking and to rediscover the importance of participatory engagement processes across the breadth and width of our staff, members, partners. We've also strived to include an intergenerational voice by tapping into Pacific youth voices who remind us nothing about us without us. We have done this by integrating strategic foresight tools. We have scanned the horizon to see what weak signals there are that could impact the work that our organisation does, to the very prominent issues such as climate change specifically for our region. We have mapped drivers of change that have been Pacific specific, always stumble over that, and seeing what really within our region and around our region, what impacts us. We have also mapped impact and uncertainty, what we are sure of and what we are not sure of. We have used scenarios for business as usual, intermittent changes to a transformative scenario in which we are all performing in the best ways that we can, optimizing the resources and the knowledge that we have. This is all working towards what our plausible and preferred futures for our Blue Pacific continent. In doing so, as we heard, I don't know if you were able to join earlier in the opening panel, is that it's really important to be inclusive and to be participatory when designing a strategy or when looking towards our futures. We have adapted the futures language so that we can be more authentic with working with our members and our communities, and not and striving to include everyone. We've also used a systems approach, that is looking at the big picture and the whole picture, not in sections, but as a whole. And this has helped the contributors to the development of the strategic plan to consider highly interconnected issues and the relationships that this entails across diverse geographical spaces. The ability to recognize these linkages and strengthen our connections between actions and investments has been central to our Pacific mat weaving, a metaphor that we'd like to draw on today. This participatory approach has helped us to listen to and be informed by diverse perspectives, interests, and insights. It's been particularly interesting to hear the resistant voices, because that is a really important part of our learning and being able to navigate those mindsets and worldviews. It has always been our intent to co-develop our next strategy. I'm sure that we are all familiar with, another plan that has been shelved. This is what we definitely want to avoid. And in learning as we go over the last 2 years, we have been building a Pathfinder Pacific toolkit that can be adapted and used for different purposes and in different ways. I suppose I will sum up here that my key takeaway so far is that the investment in genuine engagement, listening, and learning is invaluable for informing, socializing, and building ownership of our next strategy here at the Pacific community. This process has sought to identify multiple uses for the findings and participatory approaches, which my fellow colleagues will speak to. Thank you, Leituala.
Thank you, Sarah. Certainly none of us was prepared for what was coming in terms of COVID-19, but you were still able to lead that process through the application of foresight, and of course, blending that in with specific ways of knowing and learning within the systems framework, allowing us to weave our Pacific mat. Now, let us now come to Fiji, to Dr. Amerita. As SPC's NCD's Policy and Planning Advisor, you are well aware of the disruptions COVID has had in the public health sector. Are you able to provide some examples of how you're using foresight in your work? And what does co-creating post-pandemic futures mean to you?
Thank you, Leituala, and Bula Vinaka to you all. It is indeed my pleasure this afternoon to be sharing some of the learning and applications of foresight in my work and in our program, the Non-Communicable Diseases Program of the Public Health Division. As a researcher and development practitioner, I've always taken a very keen interest in examining and analyzing deeper systemic and transdisciplinary issues and perspectives and developing solutions in the same vein. I find and I agree that many times it's the lack of understanding of deep culture within the norms of society, and also trying to understand the inner stories and blind spots of issues, that these often lead to system, program, or intervention failures. In my current professional workspace, I've been using Foresight in undertaking NCD policy analysis work. This is since when I was introduced to the course in April of this year, and particularly trying to better understand policy framings and how they shape policy responses in the NCD space. And I'm applying this learning as well in supporting our Pacific Island countries and territories in their NCD-related policy work. A key part of the policy analysis work for me has been mapping out actions that can be taken by our non-health sectors to affect NCD prevention and control through the use of the Futures Triangle, particularly because of the way NCD framing in the region calls for a multi-sectoral response, a whole of society and whole of government response. So I've been using the Futures Triangle to map out and to understand better some of the drivers of change that are contributing to the push that we want to create for that vision of a multi-sectoral response, some of the pools in realizing that vision of a multi-sectoral response in NCD work, and then of course some of the weights of the past, some of the barriers that have over and over time, they've been the cogs in the wheel and they have hindered the multi-sectoral response call that NCD framing in the region calls for. Across the region, in my observations in working in this space now for 2 years, is that we have very comprehensive frameworks, but when it comes to implementation, when it comes to monitoring and enforcement, and when it comes to evaluation of our policies, there's a gap there. So there's a need to unpack these, the convergence of these drivers of change, unpack the cogs in the wheel, in shaping that future of this multi-sectoral response that we are trying to create in the NCD framing across the region. And I'm of the view that that requires a better understanding of various factors, such as looking at actor interests and influences, how policy issues are framed and the dynamics therein, looking at governance structures and capacities, looking at all these drivers of change that are very much anchored in the weights of the past in decision-making processes across the region. Further to this, because of the critical uncertainties that are relative to the work of policy, this year we've also in our team been developing a series of policy webinars where we are unpacking the policy narrative, you know, with the main objective of getting our focal points to develop an understanding of the driving forces in their NCD policy environments. We recognize that a lot of our non-communicable diseases focal persons, they are not policy professionals. This is an added part to their daily work, something that's very common across the region, wearing many hats. So we are engaging with countries in these webinars, Talanoa, with countries of how to influence policy, how they can go about strengthening their policy-making processes, and more importantly, adding on tools to their existing policy toolkits that can then help them through different parts of the policy-making process. You would have heard, if you were in the earlier session with Emily Sharp and the group, you know, they had mentioned that policymaking, it is not black and white. It tends to change based on a lot of external circumstances. There's a lot of various factors in the policymaking cycle. And we as a team, we certainly recognize that there are policy issues that one can struggle to predict and ultimately to prioritize. So Futures Thinking has valuable tools that we will be working closely with countries on. Now, this work has only just begun, but our aim is to bring together policy scenarios that focal points are working with at their national levels, to have our focal points challenge and reconceptualize their understanding of their NCD-related policy environment and the dynamics and trends that drive its development, to develop these stories, and then for us to explore with them how different conditions might support or interrupt their NCD policy ambitions. So while it's important for our countries across the region to be understanding where we are now today, as part of our policy responsibilities, we also need to be understanding where we are going and our direction of travel. And for me, futures thinking really reinforces what we as Pacific voyagers are already attuned to.
Thank you, Dr. Amerita. Policy is a key part of the work that we do. And I think as an organization, we've got so much to learn from your practice and how you've been able to steer your way, addressing some of the dynamics of the NCD policy discourse using Foresight. So thank you for sharing that. My other question for you, Dr. Amerita, is on the 6 pillars and how it has been used not only at the organizational level, but also to strategic planning for your NCD work. Can you tell us more about that?
Leituala. Yes, as a program, we are also broadening our future perspectives and trying to adapt strategies through the 6 pillars approach to meet the rapid pace of change in the region, particularly now as we are dealing with a syndemic, not only a non-communicable diseases crisis, but of course the COVID-19. With the leadership of our team leader who's been spearheading this work, we have used these approaches to develop our key focus areas for our next program business plan for 2022 to 2025. Firstly, to inform the design of new strategies, we've been assessing and mapping existing global and regional NCD strategies and policy frameworks. And through that, we've been identifying some of the progress and some of the challenges that have been associated with these frameworks. And this has also informed the type of technical support that we will need to be giving to countries, the technical support that we can take from our development partners to assist us with the work that we do, and of course the support that's already available in country that our Pacific Island countries and territories focal persons can capitalize on. Following this mapping, we've also been identifying as a team some of the key emerging issues or the potential drivers of change and their likely flow-on effects to the work that we are doing. So from this analysis, we've been looking at things such as what are the socio-economic and environmental factors that will contribute or that will hinder the progress of the work that we do in the NCD space, looking at some of the comorbidity and cross-cutting factors, especially now with COVID, looking at technology and looking at digital transformation and communication factors, especially given that that can also provide opportunities to continue with our interventions and fight against NCDs, but there can also be challenges with that in hindering progress. And in doing that, in mapping out those potential drivers of change, it has then enabled us to develop some transformative scenarios and for the team to sit and reflect, okay, if we consider, we've considered 3 possible scenarios of change. So if we take on no change and we continue with business as usual, what are the implications of that for the work that we're doing in NCDs? If we take on a radical change, if a complete overhaul of our work program, what will that look like? And of course, if we're taking on an adaptive change, what will that look like in terms of the support that we give our countries across the region? And so in considering these scenarios of change, we as a team have then identified that an adaptive incremental approach will be most suitable and will be fit for purpose. And it will also strengthen not only the support that we give, but also takes into account the fact that the NCD landscape is evolving and it's not something that's static. And so finally, we've also been using the backcasting methodology. That is just to help us reframe our existing NCD strategies for implementation through prioritized expanded actions that we are now focused on. And to strengthen these actions as well for our new business plan cycle in 2022 to 2025. And of course, it will also contribute in paving our path for the 2050 Blue Pacific plan that the whole organization is working towards. So moving forward for our program, Foresight will continue to assist us. I'm of the view, and our team's of the view, in navigating better between the short-term, the medium-term, and long-time horizons, particularly in using futures and the value it has to create more flexibility with expanding or integrating new focused activities identifying what is likely to continue, and of course, what could possibly change in the near future.
Thank you, Dr. Amerita. And it's indeed really interesting to hear some of that detail around the application of foresight to your work. Now, I was going to ask the next question to Kristel, but I understand she's dropped off the call. So perhaps we will come back to Kristel. But we'll come back to Kristel. But before we do that, I'm sorry, Dr. Amerita, to keep asking you these questions. I wanted to ask you about your recently published reflection in the Journal of Future Studies on policy metaphors in the Pacific. Can you perhaps elaborate on some of the key takeaways for those that may not have read your paper?
Thank you, Leituala. I feel like I'm running a 100-meter race here. The paper, it draws attention to policy metaphors of the two key crises that's particularly impacting our region, and that's the NCD crisis and, of course, COVID-19. So in the paper, I describe how political economic factors that are framed through economic and war metaphors of framings, how these have defined and constructed the reality of the problems currently faced in the region, and in doing so, how it has also gained currency and become entrenched in public health policies that tend to support economic growth at the expense of human health. In the paper, I use causal-led analysis and the futures triangle to explore a number of issues across the economy as a body metaphor, which I argue to be at work in NCD-related policies across the region, and the martial war metaphor at work in public health policies, and I've used Fiji as a case study to illustrate that. For the economy as a body metaphor, I make the point in the paper that while the framing of NCDs as an economic burden has been effective in gaining political momentum and has been effective in gaining development partner support for an articulate plan to combat NCDs. It has been effective in bending the cost curve and putting countries on a path to more sustainable financing. But a major challenge remains in all of that. And I argue that because of the economic framing, the multi-sectoral response demanded from that economic framing, it takes out of view deeper elements that hinder multi-sectoral response. And the region, the reality is across the region, our governments and the sectors within government, they very much work in silos. So for the war metaphor, I state in the paper that while it has been highly appealing as a tool of political rhetoric, and while it helps to illustrate the scale of the challenge that Fiji has at the moment with dealing with COVID, it cautions on how the use of the war metaphor can also hide several pitfalls that result from a policy response curtailing civil liberties. And we see that playing out in Fiji, particularly with socioeconomic frustrations faced across Fiji. So in using these foresight tools in the analysis, the paper calls for a shift in the public policy discourse for future crisis preparedness in the region, that we need to focus on the use of the polis model, the use of community and hidden storylines to create alternative strategies. The paper concludes that whenever policy is developed, the economic and war metaphors that I've applied in the paper, it shows how framings can construct our realities very differently, shows the power in framings to naturalize and to perpetuate particular worldviews, which then influence the identification and consideration of solutions. The role of framing and how it can erase from view the roles of actors, processes, relations, and systems, which are important parts of the policy landscape, but tend to be focused from our focus of policy responses. And also it concludes in saying that, you know, the use of these metaphors and framings, it can shift responsibility, it can magnify the crisis at hand, and it can also effectively support claims about the urgency and the extent of required interventions for the crisis that we are facing.
Thank you, Dr. Amerita, and I promise that was the last question for you. We apologize that our colleague Kristel Griffiths has dropped off the call, but we did have I did have a couple of questions for Kristel. So I'm going to ask Sarah Mecartney if she can respond to some of these questions I had for Kristel. And this is around the involvement of your team in setting up a foresight and futures thinking community of practice within the Pacific community. Sarah, are you able to tell us a bit about what you guys did and what you learned from this experience?
Thank you, Leituala, and a big shout out for my colleague, Kristel, SPC's first strategy and foresight advisor. This is her story to tell, as it's really been her drive and her initiative and her commitment to the story. Unfortunately, her location in Mema has lost access to internet, but Kristel, being Kristel, has left a script that I will try and do justice to on her behalf. So this one's for you, Kristel. She wanted to make a big note that the principles of inclusivity, reciprocity, and the co-creating and sharing of knowledge have been guiding the development of SPC's strategic plan. From the outset, we were very clear that we wanted to deliver a strategic plan that our members and equally our staff could see themselves in. And for us, this meant providing the space to meaningfully contribute to its development and be in a position to take forward this in practice. Recognizing the inclusive and participatory nature of strategic foresight as a methodology, we saw real opportunities for engaging our staff from across the region and connecting their broad technical knowledge, experience, and perspectives to help us create a robust, future-focused plan. Beyond the plan, we also saw an opportunity to grow our future literacy as a skill set that cuts across all disciplines, which is why, and this is Kristel's core focus this year, has been creating an SPC Futures community of practice, not only to demonstrate reciprocity to our staff, motivated to contribute to their knowledge for the development of the strategic plan. So how did Kristel start this? In early to mid-2020, SPC was already pivoting and adapting to COVID-19. We held a series of 5 online participatory workshops when Zoom was fresh and young and novel in strategic foresight, which was co-designed with the University of Queensland's Centre for Policy Futures. The workshops were attended by around 150 staff from across our organisation. From these initial workshops, we identified the staff who were most engaged and excited about the use of foresight, and offered a capacity development opportunity to trial the online Become a Futurist course delivered by the Meta Futures School. I'm just going to pause because I believe Kristel may have arrived. Has she arrived? Yay, she's back.
Yes.
Kristel, over to you. I'm up to the 150 staff from across the workshop. Moment. So how did we start? How did we start the community of practice in early to mid 2020? We really have become interchangeable, Kristel. People will talk. Over to you.
Let me see. So hang on. So did we cover where we started?
We're just in the early to mid 2020, starting the online workshops with UQ.
Okay. And from these initial workshops, we identified the staff that were most engaged about the use of foresight and offered them a capacity development opportunity to trial for us for the first time the Become a Futurist course delivered by the Meta Futures School. So holding true to our principles of inclusivity, we made sure we had a diverse range of participants from all levels of the organisation. We had 20 staff who took us up on this offer, and they formed our first cohort of futurists who began the course in late December. And it's this initial cohort that started and formed our budding community of practice. And so this, and which has involved the sharing of knowledge through group learning and reflection sessions, providing peer support to each other, and the sharing of resources and the use of futures work from across our organisation and with our partners, and also providing the opportunity to benefit from action learning and mentorship. In terms of where we are today, about a year later, we have 45 staff who've completed the course, and we have teams that are really investing in foresight as a core capability, with team leads across our public health teams and land resources, all skilled in foresight. And now we have a number of staff taking their learning to new levels by becoming certified futurists, such as my fellow panelist, Dr. Amerita. And you would have seen that Professor Sahel has already shared her paper in the chat. And she recently published a paper on policy metaphors in the Pacific region. In terms of the questions on what lessons that we have, I don't see this as too dissimilar from other communities of practice. They thrive on social energy. And so for me, I've really seen that it's about looking to where the energy is, where the interest, investing in this and growing this organically and encouraging it. It's also about being inclusive, providing these opportunities for all, not just the higher levels, and supporting our foresight champions across the organisation. And for us, it's been a real bonus that we've had both the Blues Pacific going on at the moment strategy and also our own strategy, and providing opportunities to apply this learning and also having the access to global expertise. Thank you. Thank
you, Kristel, for really being the pillar holding up our foresight work in such a challenging context. You know, the focus on values that was referenced at the start of your response is so critical in the work of any organization. And I think for us, the foresight work has really helped reinforce those values in the way that we deliver and engage with our target audience. I had one more question for you, Kristel. You touched on this, but I wonder if you can elaborate on what you see are some of the benefits of creating a community of practice.
Thank you, Leituala. I really see that there's 3 levels of benefits. The first is to the strategic plan process. We've had more than 150 staff engaged in at least one strategic foresight activity for the plan. And as Sarah mentioned, this is involved using the futures triangle, developing scenarios, using causal layered analysis and backcasting. And for us, having a community of practice or a core group of staff that are familiar with the methodology means that we can move from the questions on our approach towards really having real engagement and the contribution of content and enriched discussions. In terms of the second level, I really see this at the individual level, being able to provide capacity development opportunities for our staff, but that's enriching both professionally and personally. What I really like about futures, and it's really relevant to our time now, is that it can be applied personally. And I think it's really important when we're at home and being able to create or think about alternative futures. Professionally, we have staff that have the vocabulary, tools and methodologies to have strategic conversations about the future and with our members and with our development partners. And for us, this really represents the value of reciprocity, which has been really important to us. And in terms of the organisation, I really see the community of practice as our weavers in connecting the knowledge across our organisation and providing a basis for transformation. So, and having leading a culture shift in terms of a futures mindset. And this is really important for where we'd like to go in creating an organisation that's ready for change and disruption, is future focused and best placed to serve the region. Thank you.
Thank you again, Kristel. A great story that I think we could look back and be proud of in future. Now, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, you've heard the perspective of our strategists and our health scientists on the application of foresight But we will now come back to Fiji, to Dr. Mema, who will bring a social science perspective to the application of foresight. As the Youth and Social Inclusion Advisor, Dr. Mema, are you able to give an example of how you've used foresight with young people? What adaptations were required? And how would you describe your approach?
Leituala. Good afternoon to you and our panelists, but most importantly, those who are joining us online. Leituala, it was just interesting when you mentioned the word wrestle in your introduction. It made me think of my neighbor, who is a well-known wrestler and a famous Samoan actor, Susunga Seuli Dwayne Johnson, or The Rock, as you may all know him by. If you remember, every time he's about to wrestle, he will say, "Can you smell what The Rock is cooking?" Obviously, I can't say it exactly like The Rock does it, but I'm hoping that those who have joined us are starting to smell the aroma of what we're cooking here. And hopefully they'll be able to take home key ingredients from the Blue Pacific continent. Coming back to your question, Leituala, I'm honored to share with you my experience in working with the Nandronga Navosa Provincial Youth Council in Fiji. And I would like to acknowledge them for providing me the opportunity to test the Futures Thinking Triangle as a foresight tool. Just to give you and our audience some background information, Nandronga Navosa province has 123 villages, and those villages are under 22 tikinas or districts. Now, in the beginning of this year, the Provincial Youth Council requested technical and financial assistance from SPC to develop their strategic plan 2021 to 2026. I was assigned from the Human Rights and Social Development Program to lead that piece of work. Now, this province has a lot of young people and villagers who have worked in the tourism industry, but have lost their employment due to COVID-19. So the workshop was their opportunity to showcase in one of the remote villages which hosted the workshop what they love doing and what have supported themselves and their families over the years, but have lost due to the pandemic. Now, about the workshop, 85 young leaders from the 123 villages participated. This was their first time for the Provincial Youth Council to do a strategic plan. So most of the participants, it was their first time to be exposed to such a dialogue or training. And for some of them, it was the first time to leave their villages. The workshop started with a sevu sevu, a Fijian cultural protocol that is usually conducted to ask the blessings of the traditional landowners before any training or occasion is conducted in the community. For me, I needed to go through this process, first as a Samoan working on foreign soils, as a young woman, and as a representative of a regional organization to pay my respect to the landowners and to ask for their permission and support for me to carry out this process. The workshop started with a visioning exercise where initially I had planned an activity called Postcards from the Village. Now, I told you earlier that most of the participants, the workshop was their first time out of their villages. The context of the villages that I'm referring to here are right in the interior, right in the footing of the mountains, or along the banks of the Tuva and Singatoka rivers of Nandronga Navosa province. To get to the capital or the nearby town, it will require them to cross the mountain tops or go around the mountains or crossing the rivers in horses for some days. Out of the 85 participants, only 7 were familiar with the term postcard. Now, the silence for a while told me that my young participants could not relate, so I had to change the name of the activity to Love Letters from the Village. Why love letters? Love letters because we are young people, and in the absence of today's modern gadgets, the connectivity issues, it's our location and the distance, we young people communicate our feelings with what's available. And this is via letters. The participants easily relate to the idea of love letters, giggled away and got on with the activity. Love letters was used as an activity to get the visions of not only the participants, but also the elders who were not there in person. From the love letter activity, the young people shared visions for a future provincial youth council and as a whole province, but also went as far as actions that will enable them to achieve the visions. The participants acknowledged in this activity that in designing a preferred vision, they need to acknowledge their past. In this case, they refer to their elders, Indigenous knowledge, and the need for an intergenerational learning, intergenerational mentoring and coaching, so they are able to navigate the pushes for their future. Only then they are able to weave their wisdom into their vision and to fulfill the dreams of their elders for them as young people to transmit and sustain the Indigenous knowledge in the future. The use of the futures triangle was a tool for the participants to further unpack what came through the visioning activity. As a collective, they need to discuss what their strengths were, the support factors, and the challenges for achieving their visions. It was also their opportunity to dialogue on some of the collective interventions and how to navigate around those challenges. The weights were interesting. In the Foresight tools, it was only looking at the weights as barriers. Here, the participants identified the Vanua traditional practices, development partners, crop agencies, and government's tokenistic approach to youth development as possible challenges to achieving their future. The group also interpreted the weight as positives or having a solid foundation that they will anchor or fall back to when they are facing rough times in life. Here, the participants reference what they have identified as possible barriers. For me as a Pacific Islander myself, I thought this was the interesting part of the training. Not only that young people identified the above mentioned as possible challenges, but have also acknowledged them as their support system. What they needed is an intergenerational learning, mentoring, and coaching. This is common for us as Pacific Islanders. We are the product of our cultures, our families, our churches, and our vanuas. Earlier, I shared some background information about the workshop, the host village, the process of working with the remote and Indigenous communities, and some information about the participants. The tool was too high level, and the activities planned were foreign, especially for an audience whom the majority, it's their first time doing the exercise. As a facilitator, I had to do a lot of observations and reading and understanding their facial expressions. I had to read beyond silence. What came to mind was the Samoan saying, "Ole fuata malona lo." Ulu in Samoan, uto in Fijian, or breadfruit in English, is one of the Blue Pacific's staple food. This saying is about and originates from the breadfruit. Fuata is the Samoan word for the breadfruit season, and lo is the Samoan for the stick that's used for picking the breadfruit when it's ready. The saying is translated as each season has its own stick. It speaks to the varying nature of the breadfruit seasons where it requires us as Samoans to prepare a lo that suits and is relevant to the nature of that season. So basically, the low used for the January season cannot be used to harvest a December season, for instance. Ole fuata malona low is very much in line with the concept of si'ile matala langa you alluded to, Leituala, in your introductory remarks. The two traditional metaphors or concepts referenced here reiterated to us that the Foresight tools are not new to the Pacific and that we have our own ingredients. And working with Non-Communicable province, it has taught me that as a Pacific regional public servant, I need to either bend my law or get a new one. So we are able to see our matala langa, in this case, in the context of the strategic plan cohesively. It speaks to our collective efforts to make the adaptations needed as a reality. I made a lot of modifications to the tool and readjusted the whole program to suit the audience. Activities were modified from general and high-level activities to village activities, activities that young people from the village can relate to. I had to use scenarios which are relevant to Non-Communicable backyards and the participants' everyday life. I had to bring out the youth in me so we can talanoa and allow room for participants to give their interpretation of the triangle. As a Samoan working with Fijians who were speaking their mother tongues throughout the workshop, I had to sharpen my listening skills, open my heart. I had to dig deeper into my mauli, my inner being, to find a common ground, what we share as Pacific, as people of the Blue Pacific, so I could help them weave a robust strategic plan that speaks to the reality of the province. A real skill to master is asking the right question at the right time, considering the context and audience, having the confidence to ask the hard questions and be able to cope with the implications of asking the hard questions. With that, I thank you very much, Leituala, for the opportunity.
Malo Faftai, thank you very much, Mema, Dr. Mema, for sharing your story and how you've applied Pacific ways of knowing and learning to progress the conversation with youth in ways that resonates with them, ensuring engagements at a much deeper level, and having strong appreciation of where our people are at on this journey with us. Your story about engaging youth is not just about the value of inclusivity, but I think more importantly, it's also about, like you said, weaving in that intergenerational elements to our strategy. I mean, we are talking about futures, right? And our young people as the future leaders and the future guardians of our Pacific heritage have to be part of that conversation. What I also heard is the importance of acknowledging where we are, ourselves, and where we've traveled from and what we bring to the space and engagement with our communities. And lastly, adapting the tools to suit our audience are all parts of what's integral in our foresight and futures practice. And so I just want to thank all of you for the valuable lessons and learning applied to the various areas of work across the organization, from strategy to policy to engagements and implementation. And I suppose trying to remain true to our organizational values of member-driven, reciprocity, culturally grounded, and inclusivity, for example. From all of your stories, it's very clear that our values as an organization is the common thread that's woven and intertwined across our foresight mats for the future. But in addition to that, the importance of context as an integral part of the work, and related to that is the adaptation elements of our work. And this connects us back to the si'ile matala langa metaphor, because as Dr. Mema was saying, ole fuata malona lo refers to our ability to adapt to the changing seasons. And si'ile matala langa is really about our ability to adapt, not only in terms of contextualizing our practice, but it's also about maintaining relevance and our capacity to respond in a changing environment. The last point I want to emphasize is the whole principle of reciprocity. And if we take the metaphors and symbolisms that we've applied throughout this dialogue, they all link back to the learning aspect of it. Because as we share lessons from our practice, we identify learning that needs to be reciprocated in order to generate more knowledge and to sustain our knowledge into the future. And so before I ask some final questions to the panel, I just wanted to bring the dialogue back to the art of weaving referenced at the start. We trust that we have demonstrated through the examples and learning from our practice how we have woven all of these elements together in a coherent fashion that makes sense and that resonates with our people. And that as an institution, we'd like to think that through all of our collective contributions and efforts, we now have a very strong Pacific mat that will be used for our sail, and that as an organization, we are ready for our voyage into the future. But let me now loop this back to you, Sarah, as our principal strategy advisor. Do you have any final reflections on what the future of Foresight looks like in the region? What is your secret recipe or ingredients for Pacific Futures? What are some key learnings from your perspective? And what's next for the Asia-Pacific Futures Network? And what would be your message to this forum?
Okay. Listening to the rock, call out, can you smell the cooking? Well, I've certainly woken up and smelled the coffee on this future and foresight journey, which always sounded a little, I confess, what's a futurist, crystal ball, how do we get this across to people who need the proof of the pudding? Does it work? It's been an extremely rich pathway of learning from both a personal and professional perspective. And listening to my fellow panelists, the common thread of our strategic design, as you said, Leituala, has been grounding in the region's culture and values, blending what is useful, such as our Talanoa, our talk story or our storian, with futures approaches has been integral to building trust in the process, ownership of product and of delivery, and support in order to learn of the multiple possible and preferred futures, not only for our organization, but for our region, our Blue Pacific. For me, the secret ingredient for a well-designed and sturdy mat is genuine and respectful partnerships. A key takeaway for me has been the significance of investing in both social and cultural learning to continue building that trust and ownership. Anyone can write a plan, but it takes a community to implement it and to ensure that it is relevant and fit for purpose. And that important lesson about relevancy is we drew across our organization. We need to know people's perspectives. If we aren't listening, we're going to get it wrong. And our members have also provided us with some beautiful Pacific proverbs and metaphors, which, in spite of my late nights trying to learn how to pronounce them, to do them justice, I will not try. But their values from the Federated States of Micronesia, their message to SPC was every voice is equal. We provide for each other, whether that is in knowledge, whether that is food at the table, or whether that is in times of need or in celebration. And from Vanuatu, we heard their proverb of we progress together. If someone is ahead, they turn back to bring the other person with them. Pacific Futures provides us with a well-woven basket of knowledge that can help us stand true to these values and to live them, not just keep them on the side. So what's next? Never been shy of ambition. As you've heard from Kristel, Mema and Amerita, SPC has really catalyzed the development of a network and wants to look at a coalition of Pacific futurists so that we who all are in the Pacific can both work and progress together. I have aspirations to establish, grow, and support a Blue Pacific Futures network that provides valuable contribution to our region's Blue Pacific vision, and to increase our contributions of practice and sharing at the next Asia-Pacific Futures Network. And I have to say, just if I can end very quickly, a big warm thank you to those who have been practicing futures for a long time and been so warm and welcoming to us and encouraging us in our learning. Thank you, Tomas.
Thank you, Sarah. And what a beautiful way of rounding up the panel's perspectives. And I believe that brings us to questions and answers. And we will now open the floor for any questions, reactions, reflections, or comments from the floor. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
So I took the liberty to unmute the audience, and also the possibility for everybody to switch on the webcam, I hope.
I think we had a question, Leituala, in chat. It was coming from New Zealand. How important is the discipline of imagination in futures, strategic foresight, and what are some of the challenges for the Pacific in this space? So it's the discipline of imagination. And what are the challenges in Pacific spaces?
Okay, that sounds like a great question to begin with. Over to the panelists on who might want to give a start on that one.
I've already spoken too much, so I will defer to my sisters in black.
I'm trying to find the question, Sarah.
It starts with a lot of Samoan in front of it.
Oh, okay.
I'm gonna do my eyebrow too. I guess for me, if I could give it a first shot, imagination is everything. If we can't imagine, where are we going to go? At the same time, it's really important to have that grounded in ways in which to get there. And for me, the use of strategic foresight tools helps us to A, dream big, B, plot out what is needed to get there. It doesn't keep us in a small space. That's from me. Over to you, ladies.
Sarah, I'm trying to find the second part of the question so I'm able to.
So maybe I could.
Sorry.
So I was going to read the question. So how important is the discipline of imagination in futures / strategic foresights? And what are some of the challenges for the Pacific in this space?
I guess I'll respond using my experience in the youth space. Yeah, like Sarah, what Sarah said, imaginations. There's no harm in having imaginations, and it's great for young people. They are dreamers. They are fearless people. So in designing their desired futures, there are. I think for the exercise that we did if I take the example of Nandronga, there was some contradictions, if I may say, with their experience to date. In them to design a desired future. For instance, they, like I said in my talk, in my sharing, that they identified as much as they want an inclusive future for them, a prosperous future for them. Some of them find it hard to understand some of the processes that they need to get through in order for them to, you know, to be fully engaged in the space and to carry out this enthusiastic to implement some of the, you know, what they have desired for their futures. So, but I think this is the great learning from the futures, the tools that we have spoken to today, is it really gave them an opportunity to come together as, you know, to envision those dreams and to have those imaginations, but to be informed with, you know, what are practical ways that they need to take, given the challenges of to date, for them to be able to get there. And as I have alluded to in my talk, they have identified intergenerational dialogue in terms of the vanua, the spaces where they think young people are tabooed from getting inside. So I think it was, you know, the tools, the Foresight tools really helped them unpack, you know, and to come to an understanding. Maybe they can't physically participate, but they need to understand the processes of getting there. And those processes are informed by, you know, acknowledging who they are and what they bring to the fore.
Thank you, ladies. I'm just really conscious of time. We've got one more question in the chat box, so we'll go to Anna's question, and then I think we will wrap up because I think we're up for time. Institutional support for this community of practice, including working with the membership, seems to be a strategic way to build shared practice. How do you suppose to reach beyond SPC's immediate constituents, and that is beyond member governments and staff, and to capture the youth as mentioned?
Okay, I'll have an initial go at that one, and then I'll pass over to Sarah for any last words. I think we're really at the early stages, but yes, over the last year and a half through the strategic planning process, we've been working with our members together, using these strategic foresight methodologies to really have these rich discussions about the future of the organization. We've also been reaching beyond our foreign affairs membership as well by sharing our methodologies at heads of fisheries and at the UN Decade of Ocean Science laboratories as well. Really simple ways, and we've also been doing that with our youth, really looking at how we can adapt the methodology to have these discussions about the future. In terms of reaching beyond, we're still strategizing for the years ahead, but I might just ask Sarah if she has any final comments on where to from here.
Thank you so much, Kristel. I think I mentioned it at the beginning of this session, is that we have made a really, we've put a very big importance on the young people of the Pacific. They comprise the majority of our populations, and they have told us repeatedly, you know, how can we help with change if you do not allow us to sit at the table where decisions are meeting. Dr. Mema has spoken about the importance of meeting youth in their places and bringing in that intergenerational aspect of learning. SPC is responsible for one of the regional frameworks for Pacific youth development, and I think this is a very practical place to start for growing that community and from learning from our young people who can teach us so much more than we ever realize. And so that to me would be a good place to start. So thank you very much, everyone. It's been really enjoyable to share our stories with you.
Thank you, Sarah and Kristel, and thank you again, our esteemed panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, on behalf of our panel, I want to thank you sincerely for traveling with us in the last 75 minutes. It is our hope that you've enjoyed the learning and that we've added value to the dialogue in terms of bringing a Pacific flavor to our Asia-Pacific recipes for change. Our practice and learning of foresight and futures thinking has given us the space to weave our Pacific mat for our sail, but that we also now have sufficient food for thought to sustain us on our voyage. Lastly, it is our intention to reciprocate the learning with our people across the Blue Pacific Ocean, whose prayerful support and tapua inga ensures that we reach our destination and preferred futures, and that we also bring home a variety of recipes and ingredients so we can again co-create future recipes for the next part of our voyage. Have a pleasant afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Soifua maia manuia.
Thank you so much, Leituala, and all your colleagues, Mema, Amerita, Sarah, Kristel. Thanks so much. I think it was a wonderful session, and I think in the chat